Our next speaker, as you can see from the program, also travels widely across the pages of Florida history. Professor Dan Shafer is a emeritus professor of history at the University of North Florida, and he's covering quite a chunk of time here for us over the next few days. And he is an expert in all kinds of international relations in the Southeast. Many of you probably already know of him from his work on the British period in St. Augustine. He really was one of the very first people to focus on that part of Florida history and write about it seriously as a scholar. His publication through the Historical Society on Governor Grant, it was a real landmark in that regard. Dan has looked at plantations in general throughout the colonial period. Probably the most famous one would be the Zephaniah Kingsley plantation near Jacksonville. Probably, or many of you have been there. And his work on that, and particularly looking at it from the point of view of some of the slaves on the plantation. His book on Anna Kingsley, on a high or shy?
Both, either one.
Either one. Is a remarkable story. If you haven't read it, you should. Dan has also been writing about civil wars in Florida. His book, Thunder on the River, really reveals a lot of the kinds of activities and gunboat action in this part of the state during the Civil War. And I didn't mention the ghost plantations of the St. Johns River, the things that the Bartrams really missed and weren't in their accounts, but are nevertheless here. Dan travels widely across the world, too. He's been spent a lot of time in Scotland, acquiring private papers that otherwise have never been seen, which allowed a lot of the work on British St. Augustine to come about because it was Governor Grant's ancestor that provided him with all kinds of information. And I have to say, I don't know if I've ever even told you this, Dan, but I've worked in the Dominican Republic, and we were working in the center of the country at a 16th century site and giving a tour to a group of Dominicans, people who were coming to see what was going on. And I gave this talk on 16th century town in central Hispaniola, and their only question was, "You're from Florida, so do you know Dan Shafer?" And it turned out it was some of the descendants of Zephaniah Kingsley. And Dan had been there and met them, and they had apparently been here, which was very remarkable. So Dan has kindly agreed to step in, as I mentioned today, and trade places with Jane Landers. He was in Maine this morning, so it's especially generous of him to do that. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me, all of you. And it's a delight to be here. Listening to you, Amy, I think I've come to understand more about myself. Being a historian is being obsessive, it seems to me. That I've just filled a terrible niche in understanding of myself. I can't let go of things either. I've just got to go wherever those sources are. If there's a letter somewhere that will fit a piece in a puzzle. My wife loves to work puzzles. They bore me something awful, but she says, well, that's all you do is play with puzzles. You're always looking for more pieces in the puzzle. That's true. If I'm writing about John Fraser, damn it, I've got to go see in Africa where Fraser lived, to see what life was like there. And let me tell you, going up the Pongo River in a dugout canoe with a horse and a half Johnson motor, paying $150 to do this, a long time ago, it was more than that now, and then getting about halfway there and ran out of gas. So guess who was the guy that did the rowing? The only white guy in that boat. Now that's obsession, I guess, is what I should have known that a long time ago, but I do hold on to these things, and I just want to go to see and to be part of it and to look at where people lived and find their papers and letters. I was afraid that you were going to tell a story about Jamaica, where the Maroons, my first research work was on the Maroons of Jamaica. And in the one town, Scott's Hall, I was famous there because the Maroons always said, I was the only white man they know that can drink rum like a maroon. So I was afraid you had heard that story somewhere.
We all have.
Next time.
Well, it is true. If you drink white rum and mix it with Coke, it's not drinkable. If you drink it without the Coke, like the Maroons do, don't drink much of it. Well, anyhow, mine is going to be somewhat different presentation, and two presentations that we can sort of run together in less time than you probably were expecting. But first of all, a disclaimer. I was asked by Michael Gannon to write the chapter that Charlie Anandi wrote years ago, and I'm not a Spanish historian. Amy is. They're all over this room. There are all kinds of people here. Paul Hoffman and so many other really fine historians that know the Spanish world. I'm not that. So what I did in that chapter was a secondary work. I used the work of the people who know, and it is not the same kind of path-breaking research that you see in some of the other chapters. And I want to just very briefly go through some of the highlights of that chapter and then do something that will look at the British period of Florida history and do something somewhat silly, I guess, some of my obsessions, but maybe you'll find it worth listening to. So the first chapter that I was asked to write is the one called Raids, Sieges, and International Wars, and is, of course, something for this book, Michael Gannon's edited revision of the history of Florida. So if you start from the 1650s, as I was asked to, it seems to me that you can come to one conclusion. It is a time that Spanish Florida entered into a very steep decline and never recovered. When you look at that tale, it's one of epidemics of yellow fever, smallpox, plague, measles, swept away thousands and thousands of Native Americans. By 1670, at the 38 Franciscan mission villages, there were approximately 16,000 Native Americans left alive. Dr. Bushnell, in one of her works, talked about Florida at that time as having become a hollow peninsula, and I think she caught it just perfectly. It was then a hollow peninsula. St. Augustine at one end, 100 miles, 80 miles away. At the other end of the hollow peninsula, of course, was Appalachia. And the St. Augustine people depended on somehow getting the corn and the levy of laborers and the corn produced in Appalachia back over to St. Augustine to help them survive. In between was really a deserted core at that time with a few farms, a few cattle ranches, Floridanos, as you've heard, people of Spanish descent born in Florida, that were working those farms and in control of things. Corn from Appalachia, as I said, came, much of it came into St. Augustine as well. Also in between were those relocated mission villages where survivors of the epidemics, the hostile attacks by pirates, predatory Indian warriors, and after 1670, warfare and raids by English colonists based at Charleston sort of forced them to move out and reduce their numbers, and they were relocated then in mission villages and farms and cattle ranches in between. By 1690, of course, the Gwali along the Georgia coast had been hit hard by English, and they had begun moving into Florida as well, seeking protection from the Spanish. They had abandoned their villages and come relocated to Spanish St. Augustine. Even 3 Mocama villages that were within 50 miles of St. Augustine could be found. The Timucuid had experienced disastrous population decline, and they had been relocated to the mission centers along the road from St. Augustine to Appalachia. And that population decline meant undue hardship, of course, for the people in the villages that had to supply the laborers as part of that labor levy that Dr. Bushnell has written about so well. It bore more heavily as the population numbers declined, and so did the demand for warriors. And as, if you've read Amy's work, you've read about the Timucua Rebellion of 1656, how it was suppressed, and how the alienated mission Indians began to leave Spanish-controlled territories and move in with Apalachicola and with Yamasee, later the Lower Creek. And that isn't enough. The years became even more difficult when hurricanes, drought, food shortages, raids by Native Americans, by pirates, as you heard, pirates like licensed pirates, I should say, a privateer like Captain Robert Searles in 1688, who killed 60 people in the streets of St. Augustine, kidnapped women and children. And of course, this led to the construction of the Castillo de San Marcos, or Fort St. Mark's, as it will be called during the British years. The greatest threat, of course, during this post-1650 period until the British come in, the greatest threat was the establishment of the English colony at Charleston. Skillfully, the English played one group against another, armed one ally group, played it against another, wiped out that group of Native Americans, and then armed another and wiped out their former allies, and were enormously successful in the process. Apalachicola and Yamasee attacked Franciscan mission villages in Guale, enslaving, driving the survivors south. Then they attacked the Timucua with other allies, and then the Apalachee. To the west of La Florida, there was, of course, a French threat as well, the French coming down the Mississippi River from Quebec to the Gulf of Mexico, claiming land and establishing settlements, establishing then forts at Biloxi Bay and south of today's New Orleans, the colony of Louisiana, and then effective partnerships with Chickasaw, Choctaw, and the Creeks. Of course, prompting the Spanish to add a second Castillo de San Marcos, that one on the St. Marks River. It's a very nice image of that. If you have a chance to look at that website that I did a few years ago, Florida History Online, it's still online with the University of North Florida, although it has been moved to the Florida Humanities Council now, but you still find it online at the University of North Florida. There's a really nice image of that fort from the Public Record Office at Kew in out south of London. The major threat then, it seems to me, that we should think about is when the English established that colony. And once the War of Spanish Succession was on, Queen Anne's War here, it led to Governor James Moore's attacks in Florida. You've heard much about that already today, so very briefly I'll mention in May of 1702, Governor James Moore sent his Creek allies against the mission Santa Fe, captured slaves, killed 400 Timucuan and Apalachee warriors, and then continued May 1702, Moore and the Creek warriors, 1,200-man force, attacked St. Augustine, sending first Colonel Robert Daniel to destroy the missions and villages at Amelia Island, then continuing south to wipe out San Juan del Puerto, or Fort George Island, the mission at Fort George Island. Next, that mission, hard to say, Perita Riba, something like that. Perita Riba is close to it anyhow. That was on the St. Johns River on the west shore of Pablo River. That was wiped out as well. And then in his attack on St. Augustine was, of course, an utter failure overall when the relief force from Cuba came and trapped his ships in the harbor. And he went back to Charleston then in disgrace. But he had a chance for redemption. In 1704, He came back then and struck with his Indian allies, struck the Appalachee villages, and wiped out so much of Appalachie. Only 3 villages remain: San Luis, Ivitachuco, and Chicato. And one of the great things that I just adored, Amy, is your discussion about the movement of the villagers at Ivitachuco as they go back to La Chua, to the cattle ranch at today's Gainesville area, how they go back there, and then eventually they are wiped out as well. But Amy found the letters that the leader of Ivitachuco wrote to the king. It's a rather moving account that I still refer to all the time. One estimate is that between 1702 and 1708, 10,000 Native Americans perished as a result of these raids. Indeed, how does a colony recover from that sort of thing? Lieutenant Diego Pena went into the villages after Appalachie had been leveled and eliminated, went into the villages, in Lower Creek villages, and encouraged Creeks to start moving in. And of course, you know the story of Creek movement into Florida, Creek into Seminole, and you'll hear much more about that with one of the speakers coming tomorrow. But of course, not only Charleston English settlement, also Georgia's established in 1732, and this very aggressive sort of military expansionist General Oglethorpe also had this keen interest in attacking the Spaniards as well. First he moves down and establishes Fort Frederica on St. Simons, and then he comes all the way down to the St. Johns River and establishes a fort on the north side of the river at what is today Fort George Island, Fort St. George. It prompted, of course, the Spanish to respond, and under Antonio de Arredondo, the Spanish did finally begin to strengthen the fortifications around St. Augustine. They built the fort at St. Mark's. They built Fort Piccolata and Fort Francisco de Pupa so that they could protect both sides of the St. Johns River, and that vital road to Appalachia would stay open. But in 1742, as I should say, in January of 1740, Oglethorpe then attacked once again, blocked the St. Johns River to Spanish vessels, added men to Fort St. George, captured Piccolata, captured Pupo, and then in May his army camps moved south to the entrance, moved beyond the entrance of the St. Johns River, and then moved on south, wiping out Fort Diego and the Diego Plains, the cattle ranches there of the Sanchez family, and then set up camp at Fort Mose. Jane Landers will say much about that tomorrow, I'm sure, and forced the Spanish to move everybody into the Castillo and try to survive once again. What he did was to block the entrance to the river, laid a siege on the town, artillery batteries on Anastasia, crashing into the fort with the cannonballs. You all know that story. Very interesting to see then what happened, how the Spanish fought back by sending free black militia. Certainly the role of the military was important then. Free black militia units attacked the Scott Highlanders at Fort Mose and devastated the camp there. And a relief force from Havana then came in and eliminated that siege as well, and Oglethorpe then finally had to go back, and St. Augustine survived once again. It seems to me that there is a period from about 1743, about a 20-year period, where a possibility of revival existed. But I'd like to know much more about that. It's that period when more Creeks came in, settled Chief Tonabee in Tallahassee area, villages there, villages at Lake Miccosukee, White King, Creeks at Swanee River, 300 to 400 people settled there originally, more coming in. Cowkeeper and Long Warrior were at Alachua and in greater numbers by this time, but they have been there since about 1750 and established cattle ranches and farms at what was called then Cuscowilla or Micanopy now. Numbers that were coming in, the Spanish had them as a defense ally, and then they began with some meaningful attempts at immigration. Canary Islanders came in. 360 or so came in 1757. I think, Amy, they must have settled right on James Grant's villa. It must be about where those Canary Islanders settled. It makes sense that Grant picked that land when he came in because it gave him the possibility of land that hadn't been started in cultivation. And then, of course, there was a second Canary Islander group that came in a year later and settled south of St. Augustine. But there was this period, 1743 to about 1762, 1763, when there was a peaceful attempt, when the Spanish governors, despite restrictions on trade with other nations, opened up trade with John Gordon, a merchant at Charleston, opened up trade with William W. Walton Company in New York, when Jesse Fish and Charles Hicks and people like that came to live in St. Augustine. There was that possibility, it seems to me then, that, of course, ended when the war, 1762, Spain entered the war as they should not have, 7 Years' War, and of course, in the treaty that ended that war, Havana was traded for Florida, and Florida became a British colony. And that brings me to the next topic that I'm squeezing in here today, and that is the British era. I'm not going to go through an overview or a more formal account of that. I just want to give rein to, I always want to relive periods. I want to be there to see things. And I want to just say something in general about the British period and then tell you what I would really like to have done, what I would like to have seen, who I'd like to have been with if I had lived during that British period. First of all, British East and West Florida were almost bereft of population. There were about 3,100, 200 or so Spaniards, Native American Spaniards that left East Florida by the end of 1763. There were 3 families that stayed, as we've heard today. 3 families did stay and prospered, did well, of course, and their descendants are here now. But everyone else packed up and left. So you come into that province, then you've got a province, nobody living there. Military, British military will come in and Spanish will depart. And as Governor Grant says, it's the state of nature. It hasn't been cultivated. Think of all those raids all around St. Augustine over the last many years and the villages around the outskirts of the town walls, settlements throughout, except for where the Native Americans were almost non-existent. It was a state of nature. Nobody here to cultivate, no one wanting to cultivate, as Governor Grant said. And he didn't arrive until almost a year after the peace treaty was signed. Similar story in West Florida as well. You start with a minimal population base with the exception of Native Americans. Far more Native Americans in West Florida than in East Florida. So the key thing, you've got to get population. Somehow there has to be population. Also the key thing is you've got to make peace with Native Americans. One of the great strengths of Governor Grant in the early years is that he went out of his way to make peace with the Native Americans. He had been the first of the 2 British regiments that came in, the officers went to Cowkeeper and tried their best to pacify, to make peace. Grant went much further. That 1765 Treaty of Picolata is something I wish I could have been a part of. Just would love to have seen that gathering at Piccolata. There is the British fort. Outside the British fort, all of the all of the headmen, the leaders of the Creeks, Seminole, are there. And you've got this handful of people. If you want to read about this, you've just got to read John Bartram's account of it. John Bartram, in his unusual Quaker language, describing the governor and his talk to the Native Americans, and the Native Americans coming back the next day and saying, you know, we're not willing to give up all that land. Well, then what is it we can do? And back then they go that night and they talk things over and come back the next day. But his descriptions of the parades of the Native Americans coming up and rubbing their feathers on Governor Grant's face, I'd love to have seen his reaction. At Ballindalet Castle, by the way, they have some of these gifts that were given to Grant. They still have them in the family. I hope that all of you will get to meet, maybe one day St. Augustine will realize that there should be a remembrance of the British period of St. Augustine and invite Oliver Russell and people like that who come down that line of Governor James Grant. But invite them to come and you would enjoy meeting them. Well, anyhow, that is one of the things I would really like to do, is to move back in time and sit outside and inside and observe that treaty. Similarly, I'd love to have been in 1775 when the war is breaking out, and Governor Tonin, who is probably my least favorite figure in all of colonial history, certainly the least favorite individual in, I'm a true bigot when it comes to Patrick Tonin. I have,
He was Irish by birth, though.
well,
For the entire kingdom.
he actually was Scot.
Oh, better.
He actually was Scot, but I think he was born there, but Scots that had gone to Ireland. But anyhow, similarly, I would love to have been at the 1775 meeting at the south bank of Jacksonville when Governor Tonin met with the Native Americans when they came, and he worked out that treaty with them, provided them, as he should not have, but provided them with arms, and solidified friendship that helped the British survive those attacks from across the border. I'm right now writing a biography of the Zephaniah Kingsley biography is done and should come out next month from University Press of Florida. So now I'm working on another obsession. That is a biography of Dr. Andrew Turnbull, who's well known in this town, not especially liked in this town, but I think unfairly treated oftentimes. He deserves some of your scorn, but I've really spent a lot of time tracing through the records in Scotland that I found, and going myself to Greece, and I'm now obsessed about knowing all there is to know about his recruiting adventure in the Mediterranean. Imagine a Scot doctor who spent 12 years living in Turkey at what is Izmir today, Smyrna then, 12 years as a company doctor for the Levant Company, coming back to London and finding a partner like Sir William Duncan, baronet, independently wealthy, George, the Prime Minister of England, as a former Prime Minister of England as his third partner, and then coming to Florida, selecting 40,000 acres of land, picking out another possible 20,000, and then going back into the Mediterranean in 1767 and 1768 with an advance agent who went to the Greek and other villages soliciting workers, but months and months of really difficult travel and recruiting, and it comes back eventually with 1,400 indentured laborers. That just is something that is unmatched in American colonial history. He was on the ship. 7 of the ships dock. I mean, 2 years this took, and of course, you can imagine the suffering being months and months and months aboard those ships. His ship, the only one of the 8, he brings them ashore, and they march all the way from St. Augustine down to New Smyrna instead of going by water. It was, it seems to me, an incredible adventure. But what are some of the others? I would love to be able to know about this company of adventurers in West Florida. Why in the world their leader spent something like 9 years, wasn't it? Instead of putting his head to business and getting down to West Florida and picking out the land, why he spent 9 years in London trying to get more land, trying to get a royal title for himself. Imagine some of the richest farmland in all of North America. That whole delta, gorgeous, wonderful farmland, almost not developed or claimed until very late in the West Florida period. I'd love to talk with him and ask him, what the hell were you thinking of, man? Buy yourself a crown, something. I'd love to have made the trip with Frederick George Mulcaster in 1773 from St. Augustine. Mulcaster was a surveyor general, second provincial surveyor general. Went from St. Augustine down the coast and hit all those plantations, and there were a lot of plantations. I think you'll see that if you look at my Florida History Online website, how many plantations there were that people didn't know about. Ghost plantations is what I called it in that book. They must have been ghost plantations. Nobody saw them, except they were there. They were there sometimes with 240 enslaved Africans. But I'd love to have gone with Mulcaster as he went all the way down to Biscayne Bay. Imagine that kind of a trip. And then coming back as well. But who was Mulcaster? Well, he was the illegitimate half-brother of King George III. He was no slouch in terms of pedigrees, just it wasn't publicized what his pedigree was, but he was a very important English military officer as well. I'd love to have gone on some of those border raids with East Florida Rangers when they hit back against the Georgians during the war and brought back, imagine driving back 2,000 head of rustled cattle that you're bringing back to St. Augustine to feed people in the market. I'd love to have gone with John Bartram and then later with his son William on their trips up and down the St. Johns River. Those are some of the great stories in all of American colonial history, it seems to me. The British years just haven't gotten their fair shake in the history of Florida. And so I'm just going to keep on writing about it, keep on writing about it, keep on writing about it. My wife says I've got to quit, that I'm 75 years old is about enough. Boy, she's wrong. Well, thank you. Sorry about that.
One question before I open it up. We talked about puzzles, and puzzles were really interesting. And Amy and Dan, I've got a question for you guys. First of all, you said Florida's the missing piece, and I've got two questions. Where does Florida fit in as the missing piece? And more importantly, what does it fit into?
Florida fits into colonial history of Latin America, the colonial history of North America, and into Indian history, and into borderlands, sorry about that, into borderlands history, into backcountry history, into frontier history. There are just a whole lot of areas in which the findings that we have would enlighten those fields and would help them to think of new questions. It makes you wonder what makes history significant, what makes us choose what areas are worth studying. And I've thought about that, and I've even written about the problem, but it remains. And I think, how do you know what's significant? What fields in history are significant? Those are the fields that people get hired to teach in colleges. And if you do not have positions in colleges, that is not a significant So that's where we need to work on, right?
But they're not hiring anybody, so it doesn't matter. So there's no significant fields.
I'd add to it that Florida really is an important part of the Atlantic world. Atlantic world studies are so important now, and Florida has until quite recently been sort of left out of that. It seems to me that more and more Florida is fitting into the historian's Atlantic worldview as well.
Yes, that's true. But if you look at the histories of colonial North America, they are trying to add something Spanish, but what do they add? New Mexico. Why? Why is it New Mexico? Well, it's founded at the same time as Jamestown. It's so easy to compare them. And you don't have to say much about it because it's so far away. It's not in contact, you know, and so it isn't all complicated. And St. Augustine starts so much earlier. What are you going to compare it with? Only with Spanish frontiers, because those are the only other ones there are. And so I understand, but you have to leave out Florida. It's too hard. So we'll do New Mexico instead. And they do a pretty good job of New Mexico. But we're right here on the edge of their colonies. Why can't we be part of the story? We have an entanglement of empires. We're right here ready to entangle. But there's another field that, strangely, is leaving Florida out more and more. And that is the Spanish borderlands themselves, which are getting to define themselves as an extension of New Spain, you know, Greater Mexico. Well, that doesn't really leave room for Florida. Florida isn't attached to Greater Mexico except financially, which is really important. But New Spain is supporting that treasury in Mexico City, is supporting not only Florida and New Mexico, but the Philippines. And we don't say, oh, the Philippines have to be part of our story. No, that's Latin Asia, that's not Latin America. So, you know, there are problems. But, for instance, there's a brand new wonderful book out, edited by Brian DeLay, is it not, on the borderlands. And it doesn't have Florida in it. Why not? And also, a new definition of borderlands has come out that says Maine is a borderland, and Vermont, and I can understand, of course, surely they are, but we can have a broader and a non-Spanish definition of borderlands. That suits me, if that's what we want. I'd rather have things larger than smaller and smaller, except that I think we need to lobby. We need to be visible. And I'm trying to do something about it. And I'm not the only one. We need to speak up for ourselves here.
And speaking of speaking up for ourselves, anybody have any questions who wants to speak up from the audience?
Define borderlands. Well, now some people define borderlands as the space between two European powers, okay? Or two white powers, American, the United States, we wouldn't call them European, but they're descended from Europeans. Mexico also, I mean, Mexico and the United States, they have a borderland because they're white people on both sides. Is there a borderland with Indians, between Europeans and Indians, or Euro-Americans and Indians? That's called a frontier. Why, you know? Why are Indians treated like they're a different kind of people? In Europe, I mean, all the different nations of ethnicities, you know, Poles and Bohemians and whoever, they're all part of the same mix. Why are Indians different? Why are they supposed to be treated specially, given special, you know, we cannot ever criticize anything they do because they are low the poor Indians. I just believe nations are nations, and some of them are of this kind, some are of that kind, and we need to bring them all into the continental history.
An observation and a question. Dan might be interested to know that there's a retired ecologist from the Florida Museum of Natural History, Dick Franz, who's using your book in conjunction with the Bartram narratives to, one, find the sites of the plants that Bartram described in his travels, and having found those sites, to determine if the plant is still there. That's been sort of an ongoing hobby of his now. The other is really to go back to both of you spoke about the notion, issue of Native American slavery. There's been a goodly amount published from the English perspective. Alan Galley in particular is, I think, very good. But very little seemingly from the Spanish colonial experience in talking about the problem of slave raids and the effects on the local populations and so on, other than your basic, really, your government reports. Is there anyone who's writing from that perspective? And I'm particularly interested, as the director of Mission San Luis de Apalache, to be able to train my staff to be able to interpret that for visitors.
Diane Bossy.
Okay.
Denise Bossy.
Denise
I'm sorry.
Bossy.
Okay.
How do you spell
She
that?
would correct you.
All right. I'm sorry, I was saying her name wrong. But does she not write about?
She is right now writing about, I've not seen it. She's at the University of North Florida in the history department. You might give a call.
How's her name spelled?
What is she writing about?
Bossy.
Okay, as it sounds.
Bossy. Denise
About
Bossy.
Native slavery.
She has a PhD from Yale.
Okay, thanks.
And is working on that. But just reach her at the University of North Florida History Department.
Of course,
Sir?
Bartolome de las Casas wrote a lot about it, too.
Hi, I'm Bob Stewart. I'm from Alabama, but lived here many years ago. I had the pleasure of working with Kathy and Amy at the Old Historic Preservation Board. Thanks for letting an outsider come in and drop in on this wonderful conference. Amy, I don't know anything about the Fuentes journal or diaries or...
Just reports.
As I was chatting with you earlier, I had the opportunity, totally outside my field, to write an entry in the Alabama Encyclopedia. The journal of Andre Pinnacle, the ship carpenter who accompanied Iberville in the settlement, the exploration and settlement of the Gulf Coast, Mobile, and eventually New Orleans, 1699 to I guess about 1711 when he went back to France. And the reason why I felt comfortable in doing it was because there's a wonderful translation of it. And it was done by an English professor, Richard McWilliams, many years ago. And Pinnacle came to be called Alabama's first literary figure because McWilliams, in translating it, sort of described Pinnacle's journals as being a product of sort of the Renaissance thinking and first encountered between the French and the natives of the lower Gulf Coast, lower Alabama River, and then of course the Mississippi. So my question is there a comparable sort of piece of writing from early Spanish Florida that you would nominate as sort of Florida's or journalist or writer or reporter like Fuentes that you would nominate as Florida's first literary figure? And the other part of that is trying to reconcile between a literary scholar's perspective on the historical document and the translation of that, and a historian's use of that strictly as a piece of factual documentation. And have you ever had a chance to sort of collaborate or think in those terms?
Well, I don't pretend to be literary. That's more down your alley.
Can I help you with that? No. Fascinating question.
Well, there's been a lot of study on the DeSoto relations. There are some fantastic pieces of literature that do come out of Florida history, and they go way, way back. There's the Escobedo poem. There is a report that, I mean, there is the story of, who is this Andres, that John Han, you know the guy who was
San Miguel.
Andres de San Miguel, of course. His report about the northern Temupa along that Mocamo, is it not Pacapacuru? And the Menendez letters themselves are fantastic. Dickinson. Oh, there's Dickinson too. Dickinson's journal. Yes, it doesn't have to be all in Spanish. And people like Alonso de Leturiundo, who wrote a memorial to the King of Spain, and it's pretty long. You really just start thinking about it, and there are a lot of things that are worth reading. What?
Diego de Peña.
Diego de Peña. Diego Peña. And what?
Fontaneda.
Yes, of course. And I mean, speak up. I mean, all the rest of you know pieces too. Fontaneda is the one that Jean Lyon was mentioning. And there is one of the Florencias, the famous Florencia family in Florida. One of them became a priest and became a historian. He has some books. There's Francisco Pareja, rather. And there's somebody named Jaime, or also Bartolome Martinez, who went down to Potosi and wrote, at the request of his Jesuit confessor, a report of his conversations with the sole survivor of the attacks on the Jesuit mission at Ajacan in the Chesapeake. There's some great pieces of history and literature. It's hard for me to separate them because some of the letters from governors are just so interesting that you could be just reading them for pleasure and for information both. And how do you say, well, this is literature and that is not? I've never found it very easy to distinguish. So.
Well, thank you very much. I feel like I'm at the McCarthy hearings with two microphones, but we'll soldier on. Thanks again. Hopefully.
Can I ask a question of Jean Lyon and of Kathy, and I'm not sure who all is out there, but is there any possibility that there can be another investigation and the location of Fort Caroline could be found? I know that, I say this because I know there are just people that are digging and pulling things up and finding the weapons, and they're just like thieves out there. And I'm wondering if there's any possibility of finding that location now, or is it long gone, washed in the river?
I think your colleagues at University of North Florida, Keith Ashley and Buzz Toonen, could probably answer that question better, since they've been working really diligently, I guess, with the grant from the state of Florida to search for Fort Caroline without success. And there are several new sort of ideas floating around about different locations for Fort Caroline, but it does seem to be one of those most elusive of Florida markers. To repeat what he said, that Jean Lyon said, it does not appear that the present monument of Fort Caroline, where the fort is reproduced, is in fact the site of where it was. But many, many people, as you know, many from UNF have worked pretty seriously at looking for it. Sure.
Thanks for coming. We've got cots if you want to spend the night because we're starting early in the morning. So thank you very much. We'll hopefully see you. Thank you.